The night Elizabeth Ashford danced with Lord Caldwell, half of London held its breath. The other half whispered. She was the Duchess of Ashford, quiet, composed, always perfectly placed 2 steps behind her husband. No one had ever seen her do anything unexpected. No one had ever expected her to. But that night, in the candle-lit grandeur of Hartwell House, Elizabeth stepped forward instead of back. She placed her gloved hand in the hand of the one man her husband despised above all others, and she smiled. By midnight, the Duke of Ashford had lost his title deed, his reputation, and the only woman who had ever truly protected him, without either of them knowing it. This is not a story about a woman who fell apart. This is a story about a woman who was already in pieces, and chose, for the first time in her life, to put herself back together. Elizabeth Ashford had learned very early in her marriage that the trick to surviving a loveless life was to find beauty in small things. The way morning light fell across the breakfast table, the smell of the garden after rain, the particular silence of a house not yet awake when she could sit by the window with her tea and pretend, just for a few minutes, that the world belonged to her. She was 26 years old. She had been married for 4 years, and she had been invisible for every single day of them. It had not always seemed that way. When James Ashford, the Duke of Ashford, had first come to her father's drawing room, Elizabeth had believed, as every young woman of her position was trained to believe, that a good match meant a good life. He was handsome. He was powerful. He spoke to her with a kind of careful attention that she had mistaken at the time for interest. Her father had been delighted. Her mother had wept with relief. Elizabeth had told herself that warmth would come in time. It did not come. What came instead was a house that ran like a fine clock and felt as cold as one. What came was a husband who was never unkind, never cruel, never anything you could hold up in front of a room full of people and say, "Look, this is wrong." He simply was not there, not in any way that mattered. He sat across from her at dinner and discussed the weather and the Parliament and occasionally the price of grain, and Elizabeth would answer and he would nod, and that was the whole of it. She had stopped waiting for more somewhere in the 2nd year. The other thing, the thing no one said aloud but everyone understood, was Lady Vane. Cecilia Vane was a widow of 30, clever and beautiful in the way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. She wore red when other women wore cream. She laughed too loudly and was forgiven for it because the laugh was genuinely wonderful. And she had been, for as long as Elizabeth had been a duchess and likely longer, the true companion of the Duke of Ashford. Elizabeth was not supposed to know. That was the agreement, unspoken and absolute, that governed the lives of women in her position. You did not know. You did not ask. You maintained the house and bore the name and appeared at the correct events on the correct arm, and you did not, under any circumstances, make a scene. Elizabeth had never made a scene. She had seen them together at the theater once, before she was his wife. A flash of recognition she hadn't understood at the time. She understood it now. She had watched Lady Vane move through their shared social world with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she had and what she didn't need to fight for. And Elizabeth had watched herself shrink, incrementally, year by year, until she sometimes wondered if anyone would notice if she simply stopped attending things altogether. They probably wouldn't. The night of the Hartwell ball had begun no differently than any other. Elizabeth had dressed carefully, a gown of deep midnight blue, her mother's pearls at her throat. Her maid, a quiet girl named Bess who had been with her since before the marriage, had arranged her dark hair with 2 small pearl pins and told her she looked lovely. Elizabeth had thanked her and meant it as the small thing it was. The Duke had not seen her before they left. He had been in his study. There was always something in the study, letters, accounts, meetings with men whose names Elizabeth had stopped trying to remember. She had waited in the entrance hall for 11 minutes. She had counted before he appeared, already pulling on his gloves, already looking past her at the footman holding his coat. "You're ready," he said, not a question, not a compliment. "Yes," Elizabeth said. The carriage ride to Hartwell House took 20 minutes. They did not speak. Elizabeth looked out the window at the London streets, at the lamplight pooling gold on wet cobblestones, at the couples walking close together under the same umbrella. And she thought, as she sometimes allowed herself to think in the dark, where no one could see, that she was very, very tired. Not unhappy, exactly. She had made a kind of peace with unhappy. She was tired in a deeper way, the way you get tired of a weight you've been carrying so long you've forgotten it's there, until one morning you wake up and your arms simply refuse. She didn't know, as the carriage rolled to a stop in front of Hartwell House, that this was that morning. She didn't know that in 3 hours everything would be different. She stepped out into the cold night air, took her husband's arm and walked into the light. The music was already playing when they arrived, a waltz, bright and spinning, filling the great ballroom of Hartwell House from floor to gilded ceiling. 200 candles burned in the chandeliers above. The room smelled of hothouse flowers and expensive perfume, and underneath it all, the particular electricity of an evening where everyone secretly hoped something would happen. Elizabeth felt none of it. She smiled at the right people. She accepted a glass of champagne she didn't intend to drink. She answered questions about the country house and the London season, and whether she had seen the new exhibition at the Royal Academy. And she did all of this with the smooth, pleasant efficiency of a woman who had long since learned to be present in body, while somewhere else entirely in her mind. It was Lady Vane who changed that. She appeared at the Duke's side within 15 minutes of their arrival, as if she had been waiting, which, Elizabeth understood now, she probably had. She was in gold that evening, which suited her enormously, and she touched the Duke's arm when she greeted him in a way that was just a fraction too familiar, a fraction too easy, a fraction too much like someone touching what was theirs. The Duke smiled, a real smile, the kind Elizabeth had not seen directed at her in so long she had almost forgotten what it looked like on his face. "Cecilia," he said, "you look extraordinary." Elizabeth stood at his other side. He did not introduce her. She stood there for 1 moment, 2, 3, long enough for a passing countess to catch her eye with that particular expression of pity that Elizabeth had come to recognize and despise. And then she said quietly, "I think I'll find somewhere to sit." Neither of them replied. She walked away with her back straight and her chin level, and her champagne glass held very still, because the one thing, the absolute one thing, she would not do was let anyone in that room see her hands shake. She found a chair near the far wall, half behind a pillar, and she sat down, and she looked out at the dancing couples and the glittering room, and she thought, "I cannot do this any more." It was the first honest thought she'd had in years. She was so deep in it that she almost didn't hear the voice beside her. "Forgive me," said a man, "but I believe that is the 3rd time tonight you've been left alone in a corner, and I find I can't walk past a 4th time without saying something." Elizabeth turned. The man standing beside her was tall, dark-haired, and watching her with an expression that was not pity. It was something closer to recognition. She knew who he was. Everyone knew who Lord Caldwell was, and she knew with absolute certainty that her husband would be furious. For the first time in 4 years, that didn't feel like a reason to say no. It felt like a reason to say yes. Lord Caldwell's reputation preceded him the way a storm precedes itself. You felt it before you saw it. In every drawing room, at every dinner table, in every quiet conversation behind every carefully held fan, the name Caldwell carried weight. He was 32, unmarried, and possessed of the kind of fortune that made people forgive him for things they would not have forgiven anyone else. He was said to be ruthless in business. Brilliant, some said. Dangerous, said others. The kind of man you wanted on your side and feared having against you. He was against the Duke of Ashford. Had been for years. The particulars were the sort of thing men discussed in clubs over brandy, and women were never meant to hear. A land dispute, a broken agreement, money that had changed hands in ways that left one party considerably poorer and considerably angrier. Elizabeth knew the outline of it the way she knew the outline of most things in her husband's life. From the edges, secondhand, never the full picture. What she knew was this: James Ashford despised Lord Caldwell, and Lord Caldwell, by all appearances, returned the feeling with considerable interest, which made the man now standing beside her chair, looking at her with calm, unhurried attention, extremely dangerous company. Elizabeth understood this perfectly. She took his hand anyway. He led her to the floor with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his right to be somewhere, and Elizabeth, who had spent 4 years doubting her right to be everywhere, found that quality both foreign and, in this moment, rather steadying. The waltz began. He was a good dancer, better than James, who had always held her with a slight stiffness, as if the proximity were a formality to be endured. Caldwell held her correctly, properly, nothing that could be remarked upon, but there was nothing stiff about it. He moved like someone who was actually present in the room. Elizabeth couldn't quite remember the last time she danced with someone who was actually present. "You know who I am," he said. It was not a question. "Of course," Elizabeth said, "Lord Caldwell." "And you know what your husband thinks of me." "I do. And yet here you are." "And yet here I am," Elizabeth agreed. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. Appreciation, perhaps, for the directness. Most women in her position would have pretended the whole thing was an innocent accident, a chance encounter, nothing meaningful. Elizabeth found she didn't have the energy for that particular performance tonight. They turned through the first figure of the dance. Around them, Elizabeth was acutely aware of eyes. Not all of them, not yet, but enough. A cluster of ladies near the refreshment table. 2 gentlemen by the door who had stopped their conversation to watch. The particular quality of attention a room gives to something it hasn't decided yet whether to condemn. "You've been watching me," Elizabeth said. "You said the 3rd time you walked past." "I did say that." "Why?" He considered her for a moment before answering. "Because I know what it looks like," he said, "when someone is deciding whether they're still willing to play a game they've already lost." The words landed quietly, too accurately. "And what does it look like?" Elizabeth asked. "Like you," he said simply, "tonight." Elizabeth kept her expression smooth. It was a skill she had perfected, the still surface over whatever moved beneath. But something about the plainness of his answer made it harder than usual. He wasn't flattering her. He wasn't performing concern. He was just telling her what he saw. She wasn't sure anyone had done that in a very long time. "You didn't come to ask me to dance out of sympathy," she said. "I'd rather know the real reason." Another almost smile. "No," he agreed. "Not sympathy." "Then what?" He guided her through a turn before he answered. When he spoke, his voice was lower, not quite private but close to it, meant for her alone. "I came because you looked like a woman who had nothing left to lose tonight, and in my experience, those are the most interesting conversations at any party." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "That's a very honest answer." "I find honesty is more efficient in the long run." "My husband would disagree with you." "Your husband," Caldwell said, with a particular evenness, "disagrees with me about a great many things." The music swelled around them. Across the ballroom, Elizabeth did not look for James. She had spent 4 years tracking where her husband was in every room, the way a ship tracks a lighthouse, not out of love but out of necessity, out of the need to anticipate, to adjust, to never be caught off guard. Tonight she kept her eyes on Caldwell's face and let her husband be wherever he was. It felt extraordinary, like putting down something heavy, like the first breath after a long time underwater. "Tell me something," Caldwell said. His tone had shifted slightly, still easy, but with something underneath it now, a careful attention. "The Ashford accounts, the northern properties." Elizabeth blinked. The shift was abrupt, from the personal to the precise, and she felt it like a change in temperature. What about them? They've been managed through Harwick and Sons for the past 3 years. Is that still the arrangement? Yes, I believe so. She frowned slightly. Why would you ask me that? Because your husband changed solicitors 14 months ago, Caldwell said, watching her. But only on certain documents, specific ones, the kind that wouldn't normally come across a wife's attention. Elizabeth felt something quiet and cold move through her. How do you know that? Because, Caldwell said, 2 of those documents have my name on them, and the signature beneath my name is not one I ever gave. The music continued. Around them, couples turned and dipped and laughed. The candles burned. Somewhere on the other side of the ballroom, 200 people were having an ordinary, glittering evening. Elizabeth's heart was beating very carefully. You're saying he forged your signature? I'm saying someone did. His eyes held hers. I'm saying it concerns property that borders your own dowry land. And I'm saying that the man most likely to benefit from the arrangement is currently standing across this room, paying no attention whatsoever to his wife. Elizabeth said nothing. Her mind was moving quickly, too quickly, sorting through things, conversations half heard, papers glimpsed and then removed, her husband's particular tension whenever she'd mentioned the northern estate. She had told herself it was business, men's business, the kind she wasn't supposed to ask about. Why are you telling me this? She said finally. Caldwell looked at her with an expression that was, she realized, genuinely conflicted, as if he had prepared for one kind of woman and found another. I came tonight intending to use you, he said, to ask a few careful questions, gather what I needed and act on it through the courts. I didn't expect you to already be, he stopped. I didn't expect you to be who you are. And who am I? Someone who deserves to know, he said quietly, what has been done in your name. The waltz ended. The final note hung in the air for a moment, and then the room erupted in the gentle noise of applause and movement and voices resuming. Elizabeth and Caldwell stood still in the middle of it. She became aware, in a distant way, that they had been watched, that people had noticed, that this would be talked about. She found she could not make herself care. The documents, she said, do you have them with you? Something in his expression shifted, surprise, she thought, and something that might have been respect. I do, he said. Then I think, Elizabeth said, with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, that you had better show me. She didn't know, as she followed Lord Caldwell toward the quieter corridor off the east wing, that her husband had finally noticed where she was. She didn't know that James Ashford had gone pale under his careful composure, that Lady Vane had put a hand on his arm and he had shaken it off, that he was already moving through the crowd toward her with the particular purposeful stride of a man who had, for the first time in a long time, remembered he had a wife. Too late. She was already gone. The corridor off the east wing was quiet in the way that large houses are never fully quiet, distant music seeping under doors, the occasional burst of laughter from the ballroom, the soft tread of servants moving through the back passages. But compared to the heat and noise of the party, it felt like stepping into another world entirely. Elizabeth stood near a window that overlooked the garden, the cold glass at her back, and watched Lord Caldwell draw a folded document from inside his coat. She had followed a man she didn't know into a private corridor at a party where half of London society was watching. She was aware of how this looked. She was also aware that she had stopped caring about how things looked sometime around the 3rd year of her marriage, and had simply not acknowledged it until now. He held the document out to her without preamble. She took it. The paper was good quality, legal weight, the kind used for official transactions. She unfolded it carefully. The candlelight in the corridor was dim, and she had to tilt the page slightly to read, but she was a thorough reader, always had been, and she read every word before she looked up. This transfers mineral rights, she said. From the Caldwell Northern parcels to she stopped, read the line again, to a holding company, Ashford Holdings. Yes. And this signature. She looked at it carefully. The name was written with a particular flourish she didn't recognize, too large, too confident. This is meant to be yours. It is meant to be mine, Caldwell said. It is not mine. Elizabeth folded the document along its original creases. Her hands were steady. She was rather proud of that. When was this filed? 14 months ago. And again, a second document, different parcels, 8 months after that. He produced a second paper. This one concerns the boundary land, the strip that runs between my eastern fields and your dowry property. Elizabeth took the second document. Read it. Set both papers carefully on the narrow side table beside her as though they were perfectly ordinary things, and not, in fact, evidence that her husband had been committing fraud. He needed money, she said. It wasn't a question. The pieces were settling into place with a grim, inevitable logic. The new solicitors, the tension around the estate accounts. A conversation 2 years ago when she'd asked about the northern properties and James had said, pleasantly, dismissively, that it was being reorganized. Nothing she need concern herself with. Nothing she need concern herself with. He has debts, Caldwell said. Significant ones. The kind a man accumulates when he lives beyond what his estate can comfortably support and is too proud to acknowledge the gap. A pause. And when he has other expenses. The other expenses. Lady Vane in her gold dress draped across James's arm. Elizabeth did not let her expression change. How long have you known? She asked. I discovered the first document 9 months ago. It took time to verify, to build a case that would hold. Caldwell was watching her carefully, not with pity, she noted again, but with that same quality of genuine attention she had felt on the dance floor, as if she were a person worth watching. I have been waiting for the right moment to move. And tonight is the right moment. Tonight there are witnesses, he said simply. Tonight there are people who will remember exactly where everyone was and what was said. A public confrontation is considerably harder to discredit than a private one. Elizabeth looked at him. He was leaning against the opposite wall, arms loose at his sides, entirely at ease. A man executing a plan he had thought through very carefully. She could see it now, the approach on the dance floor, the careful questions, the deliberate choice to tell her rather than simply act. You said you came intending to use me, she said, to ask careful questions. Yes. What were you going to ask? A brief pause. Whether the second document had ever crossed your desk, whether you'd signed anything related to the boundary land without fully understanding what you were signing. It's been done before, a wife's signature obtained under the guise of routine household papers. Elizabeth felt something cold move through her, and if I had signed something. Then you would have been implicated, Caldwell said, whether your husband intended that or not. He held her gaze. I needed to know which way it stood before I acted. The music from the ballroom filtered through the walls, muffled and golden. A waltz was beginning, someone else's waltz, someone else's uncomplicated evening. But you didn't ask, Elizabeth said slowly. You told me instead. You told me instead of using me as a source, she pressed. You came to gather information and you gave it instead. Why? Caldwell was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Because you looked at me on that dance floor, he said, and you asked me the real question instead of the polite one, and I found I couldn't. He stopped. Began again. I have spent 9 months building this case with considerable care. I have not in that time spent much energy thinking about what it would mean for you. Tonight I found I could not avoid it. Elizabeth studied him. This man who was her husband's enemy, who had come to this party with a plan, a pocket full of damning documents, and, apparently, an inconveniently functional conscience. What happens now? She asked. Caldwell said. I return to the ballroom. I present the documents to Ashford directly in front of witnesses, and I inform him that the matter will be referred to the courts in the morning unless he agrees to sign over the boundary land tonight, which is all I actually want. The mineral rights parcel I intend to pursue through proper channels regardless. He paused. What happens to him after that depends largely on how foolish he decides to be about it. Elizabeth absorbed this. And me. You are not part of my case, he said. You never were. Nothing in those documents touches you. But I am his wife. Whatever happens to him, Caldwell said carefully, will be the consequence of what he chose to do, not what you chose to do. Those are different things. Even the law understands them as different things. Another pause, quieter. Though I recognize the law's understanding and lived experience are not always the same. It was, Elizabeth thought, an unexpectedly precise observation for a man who was supposed to be simply her husband's adversary. She looked at the documents on the side table. 4 years of marriage, 4 years of silence and adjustment, and the careful management of a life that had never quite fit. 4 years of standing 2 steps behind a man who had, it now appeared, been systematically dismantling the very ground she stood on while she held her champagne glass and smiled at the right people. She thought about her dowry land, the boundary strip. Her mother had left her that land, not much, in the grand scheme of Ashford wealth, but hers. Specifically, deliberately hers. Her mother had been a careful woman who had understood exactly the kind of marriage her daughter was being sent into, and had done the one small thing within her power to make sure Elizabeth always had something that could not be taken, except it nearly had been. Something settled in Elizabeth's chest. Not anger exactly, though anger was there, quiet and clean and clarifying. Something more like the feeling of a compass finding north after a long time spinning. I want to be there, she said. Caldwell looked at her. When I confront him. Yes. That will cause a scene, he said. People will talk. They are already talking about the dance, if you are present when. They have been talking about me for 4 years, Elizabeth said. They have been watching me not notice things I noticed and not say things I thought and not react to things that would have broken a less well-trained woman. I am very tired of providing them with a performance of dignity. She met his eyes steadily. I would like, for once, to simply be present for what is actually happening in my own life. A long moment of silence. Then Caldwell straightened from the wall, picked up both documents from the side table, and held out his arm. Then come, he said. She almost didn't notice as they walked back toward the ballroom doors that Lord Caldwell had tucked the documents back inside his coat with one hand and had, with the other, adjusted his pace to match hers exactly. Not leading, not following, walking beside her. It was such a small thing, so ordinary. The kind of thing a woman might not even register, might walk past entirely, might file away as nothing. Elizabeth registered it. She filed it away as something. They heard James before they saw him. His voice, low, controlled, the tone he used when he was furious and being careful about it, came from just inside the ballroom doors, directed at a footman who happened to be standing in the wrong place. Elizabeth and Caldwell stopped. James turned. For a moment, just a moment, the 3 of them were suspended in the light of the doorway, the ballroom blazing behind James, the corridor dim around Elizabeth and Caldwell, 200 people visible in the room beyond, and the whole situation perfectly, horribly clear to everyone involved. James Ashford looked at his wife. Then he looked at the man standing beside her. Then he looked at his wife again. Something passed across his face, something she had not seen there before. Not anger first, not cold calculation, not the composed management of an inconvenience. Something older, something that in another life, in a different marriage, she might have called fear. Elizabeth, he said. She had heard him say her name 1,000 times. He said it now differently, as if he were, for the first time, actually speaking to her. She let the silence hold for one beat. 2. James, she said, Lord Caldwell has something he'd like to discuss with you." And she watched her husband's face as he understood, with absolute clarity, that whatever had been about to happen to him had just become considerably worse. James Ashford was a man who had always known how to manage a room. It was perhaps his greatest skill, greater than his management of the estate, greater than his political connections, greater, certainly, than his management of his marriage. He could walk into any gathering, read its currents in 30 seconds, and position himself precisely where he needed to be. He knew when to speak and when to be silent. He knew how to make a problem disappear before it became visible. He looked at his wife standing beside Lord Caldwell in the doorway of the East Corridor, and he knew, with the cold, immediate certainty of a man whose greatest skill had just failed him, that this problem was already visible. "We should speak privately," he said. His voice was even. It cost him something to keep it that way. "I don't think that will be necessary," Caldwell said pleasantly. "What I have to say is quite straightforward. This is not the place. I find it's a perfectly adequate place." Caldwell's tone was agreeable, unhurried, the tone of a man with all the time in the world and every advantage in the room. "Unless you'd prefer to have this conversation at the courthouse tomorrow morning, I'm entirely flexible." A muscle moved in James's jaw. Elizabeth watched it. She had seen that particular tension 100 times, at dinner when the accounts were worrying him, in church when a neighboring landowner he disliked appeared in the next pew, but she had never understood what it meant until tonight. It meant he was calculating. It meant the pleasant surface of him was working very hard to hold. Around them, the ballroom continued. Most people were still occupied with their own evenings, their own conversations, their own glasses of champagne. But a handful had noticed the two gentlemen near the door, a group of ladies who had paused their circuit of the room, a silver-haired earl who had an excellent view of the doorway and the expression of a man storing information for later use. Enough witnesses. James understood that too. She could see him understanding it. "Very well," he said quietly. "Say what you have to say." Caldwell drew the first document from his coat. He did not unfold it, simply held it where James could see the seal, the particular weight of it, the official nature of its existence. James went very still. "14 months ago," Caldwell said, with the calm precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment 9 months and was delivering it exactly as planned, "a legal transfer of mineral rights was filed with the county courts. The document bore my signature authorizing the transfer of rights from the Caldwell Northern parcels to Ashford Holdings." He paused. "I did not sign that document." "That's a serious accusation," James said. "It is," Caldwell agreed. "I've also found a second document 8 months later concerning the boundary land adjacent to the Ashford dowry property, also bearing my signature." Another pause. "Also not mine." The silver-haired earl had moved slightly closer. One of the ladies had put her hand on her companion's arm, and neither of them was pretending to look elsewhere anymore. James's eyes moved to Elizabeth. She met them steadily. "My solicitors," he began. "Your solicitors changed 14 months ago," Caldwell said, "specifically on certain documents, the ones you didn't want your previous firm to see." A brief pause. "I've spoken with Harwick and Sons. They were quite forthcoming." The color in James's face had shifted. Not pale, he was too controlled for that, but something underneath the composure was under enormous pressure. Elizabeth could see it. She wondered how she had ever looked at this face and seen safety. "Whatever discrepancy exists in the documentation," James said, with the careful tone of a man constructing a position, "can be addressed through the appropriate legal channels." "I intend to address it through exactly those channels," Caldwell said, "beginning tomorrow morning, unless—" he let the word sit for a moment, "unless you sign the boundary strip back to the correct ownership tonight. My solicitor is outside. The document is prepared." He tilted his head slightly. The mineral rights I will pursue through the courts regardless. That matter is beyond tonight's negotiation. But the boundary land a glance, almost imperceptible, toward Elizabeth. That I am willing to resolve here. Elizabeth understood what he was doing. The boundary land bordered her dowry property. He was giving her that back, tonight, quietly before the court process made everything loud and public and ruinous. She hadn't asked him to. He was doing it anyway. She kept her face still. James's eyes moved between them. She watched him recalibrate, watched him look at Caldwell and see an enemy with documentation, and a solicitor outside and witnesses accumulating at a perfectly judged distance. Watched him look at his wife and see, she wasn't sure what he saw. Something different from what he usually saw, perhaps. Something that didn't move when he looked at it. "Fine," James said. The word came out flat, stripped of everything. "I'll sign it." "Excellent," Caldwell said warmly, as if this had always been the natural conclusion. "Shall we step outside, then? My solicitor is just by the entrance. It won't take long." James straightened his jacket. He looked at Elizabeth one more time, and this time there was something in it she hadn't expected. Not anger, not calculation, something closer to shame. She didn't soften. She had spent 4 years softening reflexively, smoothing over every sharp edge so that the household could run and the surface could remain unbroken. She stood where she was and let him look and gave him nothing. He turned and walked toward the entrance with Caldwell beside him. Elizabeth stayed in the doorway. The silver-haired Earl caught her eye and gave her a small, courtly nod. The kind of nod that meant, "I saw that, and I will remember it well." One of the ladies detached herself from her group and came toward Elizabeth with a warm expression that Elizabeth recognized as the particular warmth reserved for women who have just done something brave. She received the approaching kindness with grace and very little feeling. She was still inside the moment, still moving through it slowly, the way you move through cold water. It was Lady Vane she didn't expect. Cecilia Vane appeared at Elizabeth's left shoulder as quietly as smoke, still in her gold dress, still impeccably composed, and said nothing for a moment. Simply stood beside her. "You knew," Elizabeth said without looking at her. It wasn't an accusation, it was simply true. "About the documents," Lady Vane's voice was careful. "No, not that. But you knew things were." "I knew he was frightened," Lady Vane said. "These past months, I assumed it was the usual sort of financial trouble. Men of his position get into it regularly and resolve it regularly." A pause. "I did not know the resolution involved Caldwell's signature." Elizabeth finally turned to look at her. Up close, Cecilia Vane was still beautiful, but she looked, for the first time in Elizabeth's experience of her, tired. As if the evening had cost her something too. "Will you stand by him?" Elizabeth asked. A silence, longer than Elizabeth expected. "I don't know," Lady Vane said quietly. And then in a voice so low Elizabeth almost didn't catch it. "I'm sorry, for all of it, the way things have been." Elizabeth looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had taken up so much space in the map of her marriage, who had been a wound for 4 years simply by existing, who was standing here now not gloating, not triumphant, not anything Elizabeth had imagined she would be, just a woman, tired, in a gold dress that suddenly seemed like too much for the hour. "I know," Elizabeth said. It was not forgiveness. It was something smaller and more honest, an acknowledgement that things had been what they were, and that the woman in front of her was not the whole of the reason, only part of it. Lady Vane nodded once and moved away. James came back inside 11 minutes later. Elizabeth counted them. Old habit. He found her in the same place she'd been standing. She hadn't moved, hadn't accepted the offer of champagne, hadn't engaged in the conversation that had gathered briefly around her and then drifted, sensing she wasn't quite available. She had simply stood and waited because she wanted to see his face when it was done. He stopped in front of her. He had aged somehow in 11 minutes. The control was still there. It was too deeply built to dissolve in an evening, but there were cracks in it now, visible cracks, the kind you couldn't mortar over before morning. "It's done," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. The ballroom light fell across him, and she thought, not with cruelty, simply as an observation, that she could see the man he might have been if he had made different choices. There were traces of it. A quality around the eyes, something in the set of his mouth when he wasn't managing anything, that might have been, in another version of events, someone worth knowing. He hadn't chosen to be that man. She hadn't been enough reason, apparently, to try. "Elizabeth," he said. His voice had that quality again, the different quality, the one that said her name as if it actually meant her. "I." She waited. She was quite curious what he would say. She thought perhaps he was too. "I have not been," he stopped, started again. "There are things that should have been." He couldn't finish it. The machinery of 4 years of careful non-communication couldn't produce the words quickly enough, and the words, she suspected, wouldn't have been adequate even if they'd come. She saved him the struggle. "I know," she said for the second time that evening. "I have known for a long time, James." He flinched, very slightly, almost nothing, she saw it. "What will you do?" he asked. It was the right question, she thought. The only honest one available to him at this point. Not a plea, not a justification, just the plain acknowledgement that she was going to do something, and that it was hers to decide. "Tonight," she said, "I'm going to ask for my carriage and go home." He waited. "And after that," she said, "I will let you know." She held his gaze for one more moment, long enough to let him feel the full weight of the not knowing, the way she had felt the weight of too many things for too many years, and then she turned and walked away. She did not look back. Behind her, she heard James say her name once more, quietly, too quietly to be anything except genuine. But she was already moving through the crowd, and the music was already swallowing the sound, and she found that she could, quite simply, keep walking. Lord Caldwell caught her at the entrance, before the footman brought her wrap. "Your carriage?" he asked. "Yes." "Are you," he paused, "are you all right?" It was such an ordinary question, such a human, uncalculated question, from a man who had spent the evening being several steps ahead of everything. She looked at him and saw that he meant it simply, without architecture. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me tomorrow." Something moved in his expression, something warm, quickly contained. "I would like to," he said carefully, "if you'd permit it." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. He had come tonight with a plan. He had changed the plan. He had given her back her mother's land without being asked, and stood beside her instead of in front of her, and asked her if she was all right at the end of it. She was not ready for anything. She was, in fact, standing in the wreckage of her entire adult life with her wrap half on, and the cold night air coming through the open door. She was in no condition to make decisions about anything beyond the immediate. "Tomorrow," she said, "send a card first." The corners of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something better than a smile, something quieter and more real. "Tomorrow," he agreed. Her carriage arrived. She stepped into it alone, and the door closed, and London moved past the windows in lamplight and shadow, and Elizabeth Ashford pressed her gloved hands together in her lap and breathed, slowly, all the way home. It was the longest she had breathed freely in 4 years. She didn't cry until she was inside the house, upstairs, with the door closed behind her. And even then, she was not entirely sure whether she was crying from grief or from relief. She suspected, by the time she finally slept, that it was both. She slept badly and woke early. The house was still dark when Elizabeth opened her eyes, that particular pre-dawn dark that feels older than the rest of the day, as if the world is gathering itself before it commits to another morning. She lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house around her. Her house, technically, the Duchess of Ashford's house. She wasn't sure. lying there in the gray dark, what she was the Duchess of any more. She rose, dressed without ringing for Bess. She wasn't ready for another person yet, even a kind one, and went down to the small sitting room off the morning room that she had made over 4 years, into the one space in the house that felt genuinely hers. She had chosen the curtains herself. The reading chair by the window was positioned exactly where she wanted it. The books on the shelf were her books, not decorative ones selected by a housekeeper for their spines. There was a small writing desk in the corner where she kept her correspondence, and a tin of the particular tea she liked that James had always found too strong. She made the tea herself and sat in the chair and watched the garden slowly appear as the light came up, and she let herself think. She had been not thinking for 4 years. Carefully, skillfully not thinking, redirecting herself away from conclusions she didn't want to reach, smoothing over realizations before they fully formed, maintaining the pleasant functional surface of a life that worked on paper. She had been so practiced at it that she hadn't noticed she was doing it anymore. Last night had made not thinking impossible, so she thought. She thought about James, not about last night, not about the documents and the confrontation and the particular look on his face when he came back inside, but about before. About the early months of the marriage when she had still been trying. The dinners where she had prepared interesting conversation topics and he had answered in monosyllables. The evenings she had waited in the drawing room and he had not come. The one night 8 months in, when she had gone to his study and knocked and asked plainly whether something was wrong between them, and he had looked at her with that careful, composed expression and said that everything was quite all right, and she had believed him because she had needed to. He hadn't been cruel. She kept returning to that. He had never shouted at her, never belittled her in company, never done any of the things she knew other husbands did. He had simply been absent. Absent in every way that mattered, while present enough in all the ways that were visible that no one outside the house would have seen it. And she had made herself small enough to fit the space he left. That was the thing she kept arriving at, turning it over in the gray morning light. Not his failure, her compliance. The 1,000 small accommodations she had made, year after year, shrinking and adjusting and smoothing until she had become so reduced that she had nearly disappeared entirely and hadn't even fully registered the loss. She was so deep in this that she almost missed the knock at the front door. It was barely 7 in the morning. Far too early for a card from Caldwell. He had said tomorrow, which she had understood to mean a civilized afternoon hour. She heard the butler move through the entrance hall, heard the low exchange of voices, and then Bess appeared in the doorway of the sitting room with an expression Elizabeth couldn't quite read. "There's a gentleman, ma'am," Bess said. "A Mr. Fenwick. He says he has an appointment with the Duke, but—" She hesitated. "He says if the Duke is indisposed, he was instructed to speak with you. He says it's regarding your father's estate." Elizabeth set down her teacup very carefully. "Show him in," she said. Mr. Fenwick was a small, neat man of about 60, with the slightly apologetic air of someone accustomed to delivering information people would prefer not to have. He sat across from Elizabeth in the sitting room, his hat balanced on his knee, and explained himself in the careful, measured tones of a solicitor who had been holding a difficult thing for a long time and was relieved at last to put it down. He had been her father's solicitor, not her husband's, her father's. He had been retained, he explained, by her father 14 years ago, before Elizabeth's marriage, before Elizabeth had been introduced to the Duke of Ashford at all, with a specific instruction. He was to investigate the financial dealings of any man who came to formally request Elizabeth's hand, and to report his findings to Elizabeth herself. Not to her father, to Elizabeth. "He wanted you to know the truth of the man you were marrying," Mr. Fenwick said quietly. "Whatever that truth was, he felt you were entitled to make an informed decision." Elizabeth looked at him. "My father died when I was 17, she said, "before my marriage." "Yes, ma'am." Mr. Fenwick's voice was gentle. "He passed 8 months before the Duke came to make his request. By that time, I had already begun my investigation as a precaution. Your father's instructions were clear. In the event of his death before your marriage, I was to continue, and to deliver my findings to you directly when you were of age to receive them. I am 26 years old, Elizabeth said. You have waited. I was not able to reach you, Mr. Fenwick said. He shifted slightly, uncomfortable. After your marriage, ma'am, correspondence was managed by the household. I sent 3 letters in the first year and received no reply. I was informed when I called at the house that you were indisposed, then traveling, then not receiving visitors. He looked at her directly. I eventually concluded that the letters were not reaching you. The room was very quiet. Elizabeth thought about the household correspondence, about the letters that arrived and were sorted by the butler and placed on the hall table, from which James occasionally removed things that required his attention. She had never questioned it. Why would she have? It was simply how a household ran. What were your findings? She asked. Her voice was steady. She was rather distantly amazed at herself. Mr. Fenwick opened his case. The Duke of Ashford, he said, at the time of his request for your hand was carrying debts of approximately £12,000. His estate was productive but not sufficient to support his expenditures. He had an arrangement with a widow of some means which provided supplementary income in exchange for social standing. A pause. The arrangement predated his interest in you by 3 years. Lady Vane. An arrangement. Social standing. Elizabeth heard this with the strange clarity of a thing you already knew, stated plainly. He married you, Mr. Fenwick continued with evident difficulty, in part because of the dowry, the land specifically. There was a mineral survey of the boundary parcels conducted 2 months before the marriage. The results were significant enough that the land was worth considerably more than your father's stated dowry value. Elizabeth was very still. My father, she said slowly, did he know this? No, ma'am. The survey was private, commissioned by Ashford. Mr. Fenwick looked at her with something that was not quite pity, more like the sorrow of a decent man who has had to carry a bad thing for a long time. Your father believed the match was a good one. He died believing it. She sat with that for a moment. Her father, who had loved her in the distracted, genuine way of a man too absorbed in his books to show it consistently, but who had loved her nonetheless, who had hired a solicitor to investigate the man who would marry his daughter, who had wanted her to know the truth, who had died before he could give it to her, and who had given it to her anyway, 14 years late, through a small, neat man with an apologetic manner and a case full of papers. She felt something move through her that was too large for the sitting room, too large, perhaps, for the whole house. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed through it. There is one more thing, Mr. Fenwick said. He drew a single sheet of paper from his case and held it out to her. Your father left a letter, to be delivered with my findings. Elizabeth took it. The paper was old, 14 years old, yellowed slightly at the edges, her name written on the outside in her father's unmistakable hand. Large, slightly untidy letters, the hand of a man who thought faster than he wrote. Elizabeth. Just her name. She held it for a moment before she opened it. She did not read it aloud to Mr. Fenwick, and he did not ask her to. He sat quietly while she read, turning his hat in his hands, looking at the garden through the window. It was not a long letter. Her father had not been a long-letter man. He wrote that he was not well. He had known, apparently, before anyone else did, that the illness would take him quickly, and that there were things he had meant to tell her that he now had to entrust to paper instead. He wrote that he was sorry for the life she had been raised to expect, the life of careful management and correct behavior, and the subordination of her own wishes to the requirements of her position. He had raised her that way because it was the only way he knew. He had believed it was protection. He wrote that he had come to doubt this. He wrote, whatever man you marry, Elizabeth, know that you are not required to disappear into him. You are allowed to remain yourself. I should have told you this when I could still say it to your face, and I regret that I didn't. Consider this my correction, late as it is. He wrote that he loved her. He wrote, "Be brave, my dear, not for anyone else, just for yourself." Elizabeth folded the letter along its old creases and held it in both hands and looked at the garden, where the morning light was now fully present, falling golden across the wet grass, illuminating everything plainly. She did not cry. She had cried last night, and she thought there was perhaps a limit, a single night's worth, and she had reached it. Instead, she sat with her father's words in her hands and felt, underneath the grief and the anger and the enormous complicated weight of everything she now knew, something small and certain and very quiet. Permission. Not from Caldwell, not from the law, not from the satisfying collapse of her husband's composure last night. From her father 14 years late, which was still not too late. She looked at Mr. Fenwick. "Thank you," she said, "for persisting." He nodded with the dignity of a man who had done the right thing and was glad of it. "Your father was a good man, ma'am. He wanted you to have this." "He did," Elizabeth said, she thought, "and now I have it." She was still sitting in the same chair, her father's letter in her lap, when Bess appeared in the doorway an hour later with a small silver tray. On the tray was a card. Elizabeth picked it up. "Lord Caldwell presents his compliments and inquires, at whatever hour is convenient, whether he might call. He hopes the morning has been tolerable. He notes that he promised to ask." Elizabeth read it twice. Then she looked up at Bess. "Tell him 2 o'clock, she said. Bess's expression, carefully neutral as always, but with a warmth underneath that Elizabeth knew well after 4 years, shifted very slightly towards something that was almost a smile. "Yes, ma'am," she said. Elizabeth set the card on the table beside her father's letter. Two very different things, written by two very different men arriving on the same morning, one a reckoning, one a beginning. She sat for a while longer looking at them both and let herself feel fully, without management, without reduction, exactly how much had changed in the space of a single night. Then she rang for breakfast. She was, she realized, genuinely hungry. It had been some time since she'd noticed that. Lord Caldwell arrived at 2 o'clock precisely. Elizabeth had changed into a morning dress of soft gray, not mourning, not festivity, simply a dress she liked, and had arranged herself in the sitting room with tea already made and her father's letter put away in the writing desk drawer where she kept things that were important and private. The room looked, she thought, like itself, which was to say it looked like her. She heard the butler admit him. She heard the brief exchange in the hall. She heard his footsteps unhurried, even, and then he appeared in the doorway, and she saw, before he had a chance to compose anything, that he had slept about as well as she had. Good, she thought. It would have concerned her if he'd slept well. "Lord Caldwell," she said. "Your Grace." He paused at the threshold, waiting for her invitation. She noted this. He could have walked in, most men would have, but he waited. "Please sit down," she said. He sat across from her and accepted the tea she poured and did not, to his credit, begin with pleasantries. She appreciated that. She was not in the mood for pleasantries. "How are you this morning?" he asked. "Complicated," she said honestly. "You?" "The same." A brief pause. "I received confirmation from my solicitor. The boundary land transfer is complete and recorded. It's yours fully and unambiguously, attached to the original dowry terms your father set out." "Thank you," Elizabeth said. "You don't need to thank me. It was always yours." "I know. I'm thanking you for making it so again." He looked at her steadily. The morning light fell across his face, and she thought, as she had thought on the dance floor, as she had thought in the corridor, that this was a man who was genuinely present. It was such a simple thing. She hadn't known, until recently, how rare it was. "There's something else you should know," she said. She told him about Mr. Fenwick. She kept it factual, the instructions her father had left, the letters that hadn't reached her, the survey of the mineral rights conducted before the marriage, the deliberate calculation behind a match that had been presented to her as good fortune. She watched Caldwell's face as she spoke. He didn't interrupt. His expression moved through several things: a sharpening attention, a controlled anger, and then something quieter and more careful. And when she finished, he was silent for a moment. "He knew," Caldwell said, "about the mineral survey before the wedding." "Yes." "And your father didn't?" "No." Another silence. "I'm sorry," he said. "I knew Ashford was capable of. I knew what he did to my holdings. I did not know the full extent of what he did to yours." "Neither did I," Elizabeth said, "until this morning." She said it plainly, without drama, because that was how she felt about it, not the ragged grief of last night, but something more settled. A cold, clear understanding of the shape of things. She had received her father's letter and sat with it for an hour and arrived, eventually, at a place that was not peace exactly, but was perhaps the beginning of it. The knowledge was terrible. It was also, strangely, a relief. The relief of a thing finally named, finally solid, finally something she could see and hold and decide what to do with. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what comes next." Caldwell set down his teacup. He was watching her with that full attention, the kind that didn't anticipate, didn't move ahead, simply stayed with what she was saying. "Tell me." "I won't seek a divorce," she said. "The process is—" She paused. "It would be long and ugly and public in ways that would cost me more than it would cost him. The grounds would be difficult to establish to the court's satisfaction regardless of the reality." She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "What I want is a formal separation. My own establishment. The house my mother left me in the countryside, it's small, but it's mine. I want to live there and manage my own affairs and be, to the extent that the law permits, my own person." "That's achievable," Caldwell said carefully, "with the right legal counsel." "I have Mr. Fenwick," she said. "He seems to have been waiting a considerable time to be useful to me." Something moved in Caldwell's expression, the almost smile she was beginning to recognize, the one that was quieter and more genuine than a full smile. "He has, I think, earned that opportunity." Elizabeth nodded. "As for the courts, the mineral rights, the fraudulent documents, I will be a witness if that is what's needed. I won't be invisible in this." She said it without heat, as a simple statement of fact. "Whatever he did it in my name, on my land, using my position. I am entitled to stand in the room where it is addressed." "You are," Caldwell said, "and your testimony will matter." "Good." A small silence settled between them, not uncomfortable. The fire in the grate made its small sounds. Outside, London went about its mourning. Then Caldwell said quietly, "And us?" Elizabeth looked at him. He met her eyes steadily, no performance in it, no calculation. Just the question, honest and direct, asked by a man who had apparently decided that whatever this was deserved a plain name. She had thought about this too this morning. She had sat in her chair with her tea and her father's letter, and thought about Lord Caldwell with the same honest, unflinching attention she had given to everything else. She had thought about the dance floor and the corridor, and the way he had walked beside her rather than in front of her. She had thought about his face when he'd asked if she was all right. She had thought about the card this morning. He notes that he promised to ask, and the particular quality of a man who keeps small promises. She had also thought about the fact that she was a woman in the wreckage of her first marriage, standing at the beginning of a life she had never been permitted to imagine for herself, and that the very last thing she needed was to walk immediately from one man's story into another. She was not ready. She also thought quietly, honestly, in the privacy of her own mind, that she might, eventually, be. "I think," she said carefully, "that I need to learn first what it is to make my own choices, without structure, without someone else's requirements determining the shape of my days." She held his gaze. "I have never done that. I went from my father's house to my husband's house, and I have always been positioned, arranged. I would like, for a while, to simply be." Caldwell was quiet for a moment. That seems entirely reasonable, he said. It may take some time. I have time, he said simply. She looked at him. You're very certain. I am, he said. About this particular thing, yes. A pause. I'm not asking you to decide anything today, Elizabeth. I'm asking you to know that when you are ready, if you are ever ready, I am not going anywhere. She heard her name in his mouth, not Your Grace, not Mrs. Ashford, not any of the titles that had been hung on her like borrowed clothing, just Elizabeth, said as if it were simply her, as if she were simply a person, as if that were enough. It was, she thought, a rather remarkable thing to feel. All right, she said, then that's where we are. That's where we are, he agreed. She poured more tea. He accepted it, and they sat for another half-hour in the quiet sitting room with the morning light moving across the floor and talked about entirely ordinary things, his estate in the north, the particular difficulty of the court process ahead, the book she had been reading, which he had also read and had opinions about, and it was, Elizabeth thought, the most natural conversation she had had in 4 years. Perhaps longer. 3 days later she spoke to James. He had been staying in the house. There had been nowhere else for him to go in the immediate aftermath, and Elizabeth had not asked him to leave because she was not yet in a position to ask him anything, and she knew it. They had moved around each other carefully, like two people navigating a space that had recently been rearranged, occupying different rooms at different hours, communicating through the household staff with the civilized distance of people who have agreed, without saying so, to wait. She called him to the sitting room at 10 in the morning. He came promptly. This, too, she noticed. He had always been slightly late in the old life, not rudely, just with the easy unpunctuality of a man who assumed his time mattered more than others. He was not late now. He looked worse than he had at the ball. The composure was still there but thinner, worn down at the edges. He sat across from her and waited, and for once, the waiting was his. Elizabeth told him what she wanted. She told him plainly, without anger, not because she didn't feel it, but because anger was hers now, not his. He did not get to see it, to react to it, to make it about him. She stated her requirements in the even, measured tones of a woman who had spent the morning deciding exactly what she needed and had no intention of being talked out of it. A formal separation, her own establishment, the countryside house and its grounds, maintained from the estate income as was her legal right, management of her own correspondence, her own solicitor, Mr. Fenwick, handling all matters pertaining to her personally. James listened. When she finished, he said, "Is there anything I can do?" "No," Elizabeth said, not unkindly, simply finally. He nodded. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked up at her with that expression she kept returning to, the shame, the genuine thing underneath the composure, and he said, "I did love you, Elizabeth. In my way, I know that's—" He stopped. "I know it doesn't." "I know," she said. She had thought about this too, this morning and the morning before, whether he had loved her. She thought perhaps he had, in the limited, self-serving way of a man who had never learned to put anyone above his own comfort. A love that required nothing of him and gave nothing to her. The kind that looks like love from the outside and feels like nothing from the inside. "I know," she said again, more gently this time. "I'm not asking you to have been different than you were. I'm only asking you to let me go." A long silence. "Yes," James said quietly, "all right." She stood. He stood. They looked at each other across the small room, across 4 years and all the furniture of a life that was now being disassembled, piece by piece, and put away. She offered her hand. He took it briefly. Not the cold, formal handshake of a legal proceeding, but something closer to what it might have been, in a different version of events, between two people who had simply met under different circumstances and wished each other well. "I hope you'll be happy," he said. She thought he meant it. "I intend to be," she said. She left for the countryside the following Saturday. Bess came with her. Of course Bess came. She had not even asked. Bess had simply appeared on Friday evening with her trunk already packed, with the particular expression of a woman who has been waiting for this trip for some time. The house was small and old and smelled of wood smoke, and the specific damp of a building that had been closed for too long and was now, gratefully, being opened. Elizabeth walked through every room on the first afternoon, touching things, her mother's writing desk, still in the study, the small portrait of her grandmother in the hallway, the kitchen garden, overgrown but salvageable, the view from the upstairs window across the boundary land, her land, rolling green and unhurried toward the horizon. She stood at that window for a long time. She thought of her mother who had left her this. She thought of her father who had tried to leave her the truth. She thought of everything that had been taken and everything that had been returned and everything that was still, improbably, intact. Then she went downstairs and told Bess they would need a gardener. The next morning, she sat at her mother's desk and wrote her first letter. Not to Caldwell, though she thought of him, easily and without pain, the way you think of something you are looking forward to without urgency. Not to her solicitor, though that letter would follow. She wrote to a woman she had known before her marriage, a friend, a genuine one, fallen away in the long-managed years of being a duchess. She wrote simply, without explanation or apology for the years of silence, "I am in the country. I find I have more time than I have had in some years, and I would very much like to see you if you are willing." She sealed the letter and gave it to Bess to post. Then she poured tea too strong, exactly how she liked it, and opened a book, and sat by the window in the morning light and was, simply, quietly, entirely herself. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not a triumphant one, or a sad one, or any of the large feelings she had been moving through for the past week. It was just a woman in her own house, on a morning in early spring, reading a book. Elizabeth Ashford thought that she had never, in all her life, felt so thoroughly well. Spring came to the countryside the way it always does, quietly at first, then all at once. One morning the garden was bare and gray, and the next, or so it seemed, there were snowdrops along the south wall and something green and insistent pushing through the kitchen garden beds that Elizabeth had spent the autumn clearing and the winter planning and was now, with considerable satisfaction, watching come to life. She had learned this year that she enjoyed gardening. This had surprised her. She had no memory of enjoying it before, but then she had had no garden before, not one that was hers to decide about, to rearrange, to let go wild in one corner and tend precisely in another according to no system but her own preference. It turned out that preference, when you were finally permitted to have it, revealed itself in unexpected places. She had also learned that she enjoyed silence. Not the silence of Ashford House, that had been the silence of absence, of a space too large for the life being lived in it, a silence that pressed and accumulated and reminded you, constantly, of what wasn't there. This was different. This was the silence of a house that was exactly the right size, filled with exactly the right things, occupied by a person who had chosen to be there. She sat at her mother's desk most mornings, writing. Letters mostly. She had more correspondence now than she had had in the entirety of her marriage, which was perhaps an indication of something. Her old friend had come to stay in October and had stayed for 3 weeks and left saying she would return in summer, and Elizabeth had felt, watching the carriage go, the specific warmth of a friendship resumed rather than merely remembered. Mr. Fenwick had been busy on her behalf through the autumn and winter. The court proceedings against James had moved at the stately pace of all legal proceedings, which was to say slowly and with considerable paperwork, but they were moving. The outcome was not yet certain, but Mr. Fenwick was quietly confident, which Elizabeth had come to understand was his version of certainty. The separation had been formalized in November. Elizabeth had signed the papers at Mr. Fenwick's office on a Tuesday afternoon, with Bess waiting outside in the carriage, and a light rain falling on the London streets, and she had felt, signing her name to the end of her marriage, not devastation or triumph, but simply the clean, definitive feeling of a door properly closed. She had taken herself to tea afterwards, alone, at the window table of a small establishment near the solicitor's office. She had ordered cake as well as tea because she had wanted it, and no one had been there to suggest she shouldn't. It had been excellent cake. James Ashford, by all accounts that reached her, and some did, through the ordinary channels of a connected world, was not prospering. He had retreated to the smaller of the estate properties after the separation, the London house having become, she understood, financially difficult to maintain. His reputation had suffered the particular damage that attaches to a man revealed not as a villain, but as something less dramatic and more contemptible. A cheat, a coward, a man who had mortgaged his wife's inheritance to pay for his own comfort and called it business. Lady Vane had married a baronet from Shropshire in January. Elizabeth had heard this and felt, examining herself honestly, almost nothing. A faint relief, perhaps, for the baronet, who presumably knew what he was getting, or for Lady Vane, who had seemed, on that last evening at the ball, like a woman who was tired of what she had and might do better with something different. Elizabeth wished her, with complete sincerity, whatever happiness she was capable of. That was all. She had thought in the first months that she would spend more time being angry, that the knowledge of everything that had been done, the survey, the forgeries, the managed correspondence, the systematic reduction of her life to fit around a man's convenience, would sit in her like a stone, weighing each day. Sometimes it did. There were mornings when she woke with it heavy in her chest and had to move through the first hour carefully, deliberately, keeping herself occupied with small tasks until the weight shifted. But mostly, and this had surprised her more than the gardening, more than the silence, more than any of the practical revelations of a life remade, mostly she was simply busy being well. There was so much of it, being well. It turned out to require considerable attention and generated in return considerable satisfaction. The garden, the correspondence, the book she had started writing in December, nothing that would ever be published, she thought, but hers, entirely hers, a story she was telling herself about herself, and the telling of it was worth everything. The morning walks across the boundary land, her land, which she had come to know field by field, season by season, until she could find her way across it in the dark. She had also, in February, begun riding again. She had not ridden since the first year of her marriage, when the demands of the household and the quiet discouragement of a husband who didn't ride and found it inconvenient had gradually crowded it out. She had missed it without entirely knowing she missed it. Bess had found her a good mare from a local farm, a chestnut, sensible and forward-going, with a comfortable trot and a personality Elizabeth found immediately sympathetic. And the first morning they had gone out together across the fields in the early light, Elizabeth had felt something come back to her that she hadn't known she was missing, herself, in motion, uncontained. She had laughed, alone in the field in the cold February air, for no reason she could have explained to anyone. Lord Caldwell wrote regularly. Not pressingly, never that. He had understood or had chosen to understand, or both, that what she had asked for in the sitting room last spring was real and not merely polite, and he had given it to her with a consistency that she had come to recognize as characteristic of him. He did what he said he would do. He kept small promises. He did not crowd. His letters were good letters. This had not surprised her. She had suspected he would write well, but they were better than she'd expected. He wrote about the estate and the court proceedings and books he was reading, and occasionally something he had seen on a walk that he found worth describing. He wrote without demands. He wrote as one person to another, as if the correspondence were its own thing, worth having regardless of what it might or might not lead to. She wrote back, at first briefly, then at greater length as the year accumulated and she found she had more to say. She told him about the garden, about the mare, about her friend's visit in October, about the book which she hadn't told anyone else about and which she mentioned to him in a letter in January as if it were a small thing, and then regretted mentioning, and then felt oddly glad she had when his reply came back simply saying, "I'm glad you're writing it. I would like to read it someday if you permit. There is no rush. There is no rush." She had read that line several times. He came in April. She had invited him, a proper invitation, written deliberately, on a Tuesday morning when the garden was full of new growth, and she had been sitting at her mother's desk and had known, with the same quiet certainty she was coming to trust in herself, that she was ready. Not for everything. Not for the large decisions, the future arrangements, the complicated practical questions of what two people did when they found themselves in this particular kind of situation. Not for any of that yet. But for him here, in her house, over tea in the sitting room as a person she was genuinely glad to see, that she was ready for. He arrived on a Wednesday, having driven from London. She met him at the door herself. She had told the butler not to bother, and the first thing she noticed was that he was smiling. Not the almost smile, not the controlled appreciation she had catalogued through the various stages of their strange beginning, but an actual, unguarded smile, the kind a person produces when they arrive somewhere they have wanted to be for some time. "Elizabeth," he said. "Come in," she said. "The tea is already made. I have it on good authority that you take it plain." "You have been investigating me," he said, following her into the house. "I have been corresponding with you for a year," she said. "You mentioned it in March." "Did I?" He looked genuinely pleased that she had remembered. "You did." She led him through to the sitting room, her sitting room, with its chosen curtains and its reading chair and its smell of wood smoke and the garden coming in through the half-open window. "Sit down." He sat. She poured. Outside, the garden moved in a light wind. The roses she had planted along the south wall in autumn were showing their first small leaves, and the apple tree at the back was in full blossom, white against the blue April sky. "It's lovely," Caldwell said, looking out the window. "Yes," Elizabeth said, "I made it." He turned from the window and looked at her with that full attention, that genuine, unhurried, fully present attention, and she thought, sitting across from him in her own sitting room on a Wednesday in April, that this was perhaps the simplest happiness she had ever felt. Not the happiness of rescue, not the happiness of triumph. Just the happiness of a morning that belonged entirely to her, with a person she had chosen, in a life she was building, one deliberate day at a time. "I've been thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said. The same words as a year ago in this same room on a different morning, but everything else had changed. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not yet ready for arrangements, formal ones, the things people will expect and ask about and have opinions on." A pause. "But I am ready to stop treating this as something that might happen and start treating it as something that is happening, if you're willing." Caldwell set down his teacup. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, not the almost smile, not the careful attention, not any of the versions she had catalogued. Something simpler than all of them. "I have been willing," he said, "since the moment you took my hand on the dance floor." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I know, that's rather why I invited you." And he laughed, a real laugh, uncontrolled, genuinely delighted, and she laughed too. And outside the apple tree was in blossom, and the garden was growing, and the spring light fell through the window across the room she had made her own. And Elizabeth Ashford, who had once been perfectly invisible, was present in every possible way. She had chosen it, all of it, every single part. There is a particular kind of happiness that comes not from being found, but from finding yourself. Elizabeth had spent years waiting to be seen. She spent the rest of her life simply being, and it turned out, when you stopped hiding, the world was full of people who had been looking for exactly you. She never did go back to London society. She never missed it. The book was finished the following winter. She dedicated it to her father. The garden, by the second summer, was extraordinary. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Tell us which city you're watching from. Reading your comments truly makes our day. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more.